Albert Einstein once said, if I had an hour to solve a problem, he'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and just 5 minutes thinking about the solution. The reality is a well-stated problem is a half-solved problem. One of the biggest challenges of problem solving is being clear about what you're trying to accomplish. We need to be able to define problems in such a way that you can easily explain the problem to others so that you can engage them in the problem-solving process. To do this, we often have to slow down our thinking, to think more critically, and really challenging our assumptions by learning to ask some hard questions. So we are going to talk about what is critical thinking, and there's many ways to look at critical thinking. One of the ways to look at critical thinking is really, are we looking at things from multiple perspectives? Are we looking outside of the box? Are we considering the situation from other people's perspectives? And during the class, when I teach a full class on critical thinking and problem solving, we also talk about the place of people's intuition and their heart in the critical thinking process, because the reality is thinking logically isn't the same as thinking critically. Thinking logically doesn't take into consideration how people feel about a situation or a potential problem. And the best solution to a problem that no one buys into isn't going to get implemented. And so part of critical thinking is trying to understand things from other people's perspectives in addition to trying to think logically about what the decision is and what the current problem is. So I often break down thinking critically into 3 steps, and one of the first things is just to recognize that we all make assumptions about a situation. We make assumptions about what caused a problem, what might be solutions to the problem, who's involved in the problem. And so it's important to understand that we rely very heavily on assumptions in our everyday lives. So the next step is then to figure out, how do we make those assumptions more explicit? How can we make them more transparent to ourselves and other people so that we can challenge our thinking and determine the accuracy and validity of those assumptions? And on the screen, I've got listed a couple of questions to get us to think about how accurate our assumptions really are. So when you look at this picture on a beautiful sunny 60-degree day in Minnesota, for those of you who are in Minnesota, what does your mind leap to? What do you think of when you see that first snowflakes, or the first snowstorm hitting here in Minnesota or wherever you live? My guess is when you see that first snowfall, something jumps into your brain. Some of you may think, time for snow angels, snowmobiling, downhill skiing, cross-country skiing. You love the cold weather. Others of you are thinking about, time to shovel. It's going to be cold. Traffic is going to be tangled when there's snowstorms. Those are what we call our mental models. When we see something, when we hear something, when we observe an interaction, we add something to what it is we're observing. We add our own meaning to the situation, and that's what our mental model is. These mental models then often lead us into making many assumptions that may not be correct. As this cartoon shows, I'm sure some of you have been in that situation where somebody has looked at you, somebody has said something, and you're like, they're thinking, that I'm difficult, the situation is difficult, that there is a problem, and there may not be a problem that really is that important to you or anyone else. The point is, we make a lot of assumptions about what is a problem and what isn't a problem when people see the situation very differently. And so to think critically, we have to think about, how do we clarify those mental models and those assumptions? Okay? These come from something called the ladder of inference. The ladder of inference was developed by Peter Senge many years ago, and it's actually a very helpful tool for us to kind of break down and think through step by step how our thinking comes about. Okay? Because what happens is when we see an experience or we have data that we're observing, we sometimes select the data that is most relevant to us. We add meaning to it. With that, we then we add some additional meaning based on our prior experiences, And then we sometimes draw conclusions about what's going on. An easy way to think about this is how many of you have attended a meeting with someone, exact same meeting, only to leave the meeting, talk about the meeting afterwards and wonder, really? Were we at the same meeting? It feels like we were in two very different meetings because we heard different things. Okay? We often hear what we want to hear. We often hear what validates our beliefs, our assumptions, our experiences, and our mental models. So one of the things we want to do is to slow down and reflect on what it is or how we came to the action that we did based on the data that we really originally looked at. One of the things I'll often do with a group, and it's a very easy process to use, is when you're having a conversation with anyone or you're trying to do any kind of problem solving, is to make three columns on a piece of paper. And you could just label them F, A, and Q. What are the facts? Okay. What are the facts? The facts are your data that you're actually observing. A would be, what are the assumptions that you're making about the situation? Okay. And the third would be Q, or questions. What questions might you have based on the facts or the data? Okay. And what information or questions do you have based on the assumptions? And it can actually be quite interesting to have everyone who's working on the same problem, sometimes from different perspectives, to fill out a sheet on fact, assumptions, and questions to better understand everyone's mental models or beliefs going into your problem-solving process. Okay. In my mind, two of the primary skills then for critical thinking are what I refer to as reflection and inquiry. A lot of times when we are trying to solve a problem or making a decision with someone else, we kind of get stuck on our own perspective. Sometimes it's my way or it's your way. And when people will disagree with us, sometimes we just start advocating for our own position. We start talking faster, we start talking louder, we change what we say, but we really don't budge on our way of thinking. It's that bubble above our head. The reality is we want to figure out, how do we make that bubble empty? How do we empty that bubble, or at least expand it to take other people's ways of thinking? The best way in my mind is to do two things. The first is reflection, and the second is inquiry. Reflection is what we just did when you look at the ladder of inference. Do you sit down and think about, what is the data? What is the meaning that I give to the data? How do I make assumptions then and come to conclusions about that data? Okay. Can you find out how other people reflect on the situation? What is their data? How did they add meaning to the situation? Okay. That's what reflection is all about. It's really slowing down and trying to think about how we climb up that ladder of inference. Inquiry, then, is the skill you use to ask yourself these questions, but it's also the skills that you use to ask other people these questions. Many times other people don't understand that they are making assumptions, that their mental models do make it difficult for them to think critically. So when you are problem solving, especially when you're working with other people, it's really helpful to learn to ask good questions. Many times we make the assumption that it's our goal to share our expertise, where you'd often be better served just asking some really good questions, hopefully to engage everyone in the process and better clarify the situation and everyone's understanding of the situation. Because our goal is to figure out, how do we as individuals walk down our own ladder of inference? Okay. How do we walk down that? And in addition to that, how do we get other people to walk down that ladder of inference? One way to do that is thinking simply, when we talk about reflection and inquiry, again, we have to identify what conclusions and assumptions are we making, okay, using that fact, assumption, and question worksheet. We need to do it for the other person. Maybe if they're not comfortable doing it, you can do a worksheet. You know, you've got your worksheet, you've got their worksheet in front of you, but you want to identify what conclusions they're making, what assumptions they're making, okay, and how did they get there. So you may have to spend some time asking questions, asking for data, both about what the meaning, what the data is that they're observing, what meaning they give to that data, and then what conclusions or assumptions they're coming to. So you have to spend some time inquiring into the reasoning, connecting the dots, going kind of looking at that ladder from the initial data that they have to the conclusions. And so it's breaking down that process kind of step by step. Only when we do this can we figure out where we are starting to infer or add meaning to a situation that may actually not be as accurate as both we or the other person thought about the situation. Okay. So our goal then is to be able to help other people clarify their thinking. In addition, we have to clarify our own thinking, and we have to state our own thinking. Okay? We have to make it transparent to other people, because can people guess what we're thinking? Absolutely not. Okay? I'm guessing some of you have maybe made a mistake when you've bought a gift for someone, okay? Because the individual might not have been explicit about what they wanted, and we made some assumptions based on our own experiences, what we thought they might like. Okay? Doesn't always work. Sometimes we have to be very clear about what we want, what we're thinking, because we can't expect other people to guess what we're thinking and what our thought processes are. So we need to make them as explicit as possible, and you can do that by kind of dissecting on that ladder of inference. Again, I stated this before, but the goal is to think about how do we create that empty bubble above our head. When we think of the mental model, instead of having a picture of the shovel or the picture of the snowman, how do we create either an empty bubble or a bubble that's large enough to include the perspective of others when we are looking at a current problem situation? So the goal is to spend a lot of time listening and asking a lot of good questions to challenging everyone's thinking. Okay? So again, how can we look at this in a way that will empty my bubble? And the goal of this is to have what we refer to as a beginner's mindset. A beginner's mindset really is just trying to think to a certain extent like a 7th grader. Or a 7-year-old. Okay? 7-year-olds don't have a lot of experiences and perspectives. They don't have as many biases that they bring to a situation. And so a lot of times we need to think about, to find that beginner's mindset is to think in terms of, if we've never been presented with this situation before, how can we think about it now in a new way? Once we've kind of thought in a perspective of how to think critically, our goal then is to really think about how do we ask good questions, because it's not enough just to think that, okay, I have to change my mindset, I have to be a little more open, I have to understand why I think the way I do, I have to spend time thinking, finding out how other people think. Then, do I have the skills actually to ask the questions once I recognize that I do need to ask myself and other people questions? So, learning to ask questions effectively is a skill that does take some time and practice. And so just a couple of tips here on the screen for you to think about. First is, whenever you're going to go into a conversation, particularly with a complex problem, is always think of some basic questions on how to start the conversation. Ideally, they would be questions to engage the other person, such as, how do you feel about the situation? What experiences have you had around the problem? Okay. The other part of it is, when you're asking other people questions, is just to, contract to see if it's a good time for them. Guess we have a typo there. to see what's a good time for them. Because if somebody's in a hurry, they're off to another meeting, they're focused on another problem, it may not be a good time to engage them in a discussion about how to solve the problem. So anytime you're going to work with someone else on a potential problem, I would always contract to say, is now a good time to talk about this? If now isn't a good time, when would be a good time for this? Okay. The other part is just use neutral wording, and we'll talk about this briefly again. What do you think of the complaints? How do you see the problem? And I mentioned that earlier. The other trickier part is thinking about how do you speak in the other person's language. Okay? We oftentimes have to modify the words we use, the phrases we use, the acronyms we use, the tone of voice that we use, depending on who our audience is. Okay? Are you working with people who are in the same field as you are, in the same industry, on the same career path? Or are you working with people who have very different perspectives, who use very different acronyms and terms on their jobs? So if you are working on a team or working with others to do problem solving, you need to think about what is their language? What are the words that they would understand? The other part is just to make sure that you're just asking one question at a time. How many of you have ever been working with someone and all of a sudden they start running on and they ask you like 3 questions at one time? Well, what time were you there and how did you feel about the situation and what do you think we should do about it? And you're like, wait, I can't even remember the first question. Okay, slow down. And that's why I said have some basic questions to start the conversation. Maybe script them out, allow yourself time and the other person to think through and give you some good answers. Okay, so we know we have to ask questions. We know why we have to do it. We've given some basic tips. What are some types of questions that you would ask? Well, there's some different types of questions. Open-ended and closed-ended. There's neutral and leading. I just talked a little bit about neutral questions. There's primary questions, follow-up questions, and then just a basic format that I like to use that's what, so what, now what? Okay? A lot of times when people come to me with a problem, they'll tell me what the situation is, but I often want to know, so what? Who cares? Does anybody care besides you? Is it your problem or is it a bigger problem that people need to address? But then think about how do we solve the problem, what comes next? So let's start with the open versus closed-ended questions. And open-ended questions actually helps you draw information out from other people. It's a question that doesn't allow a yes or no response. That's what a closed-ended question is. If you ask a closed-ended question, all people can say is yes or no. Did you like that dinner last night? Okay. Doesn't leave a lot of room for a person to really think and add on to the discussion. So sometimes closed-ended questions start with would, should, is, are, do you, okay? How do you, did you? Different things like that. Open-ended questions really allow the person to give their opinions and perspectives. So instead of saying, did you like dinner last night? Tell me about your dinner experience last night. Okay? Something on an open-ended question that is helpful is to use, some of you may have remembered growing up that you had the journalist's 6 questions. Maybe you learned that in junior high. The kind of who, what, where, when, why, and how. Always good words to start a question. Where was this experience? When did it happen? Who was involved? And while they may seem somewhat closed-ended, they are a little more open, especially if you ask how. And you can build on these questions by saying who else, when else, what else. Okay? This sounds very easy to do, but when we're in the classroom, we actually practice this exercise, and it is very, very difficult to ask open-ended questions. I find myself sometimes going to that closed-ended questions just because it's natural, it's quick. Challenging yourself to ask open-ended questions to allow other people a question that's going to let them give their perspectives, their details, is a really difficult skill that takes some time to practice. And I would challenge you and ask, especially those of you who are sitting in a room with other people, challenge each other to stop each other next time you're in a meeting and say, wait, I have more to say. Let's ask that question in a different way. Okay? so that my opinion will be heard. So an open-ended question allows people to say more about what they think without limiting the response. Neutral versus leading, okay? A leading question is really kind of a rhetorical question. You know what you want to hear. And sometimes when we're trying to problem solve, we have ideas of what the solution is in our own mind. We want to be careful not to project our perception of the problem and our perceived solution to the problem by using a leading question. I've got an example on there. Should we assume that X is causing the problem? So two things going on here. It's a closed-ended question, but it's also a rhetorical question because you're trying to lead the other person into seeing things from your perspective rather than trying to see things from the other person's perspective or to dissect the problem in a way that everyone can understand. So a neutral question, again, would be more open-ended, and it doesn't include a possible solution or a possible identification of really how you even perceive the problem. Next is there's kind of that primary and follow-up questions. As I said before, if you're going to engage other people in problem solving, sometimes write down a few questions, have a primary question or two to get it started. Have you experienced that problem? Okay. How did you experience that problem? When did you experience it? They can be more closed-ended or short questions, but then have follow-up questions which will dig deeper. And sometimes you don't know what the follow-up questions are going to be until you start listening to the other person. And so we have to be open-minded to think about, are we willing to go in a direction that we can keep drawing information from the other people? How did it impact you? What more can you tell me? Who else should I talk to? What part of this problem or situation have you seen that no one else has seen or that I might not understand? Sometimes it's helpful even to do a worksheet. And this is just a quick example of a worksheet. What is happening? What isn't happening? Okay, so what assumptions can you make based on if you fill this out from your perspective, you have other people who are looking at the problem, fill this out, you can come together and talk about, therefore, what conclusions can we make about the situation and how to deal with it. Also asking questions. This is probably one of my favorites. I always like to ask what, so what, now what? So what is the issue that's going on? Okay, what is the issue that you see? What's the basic need? What's the outcome? What's not working? The so what gets to who's impacted. Is there a benefit? Who will benefit? How significant is the issue? Is it important to be dealt with now, or is it something that can wait? That kind of leads you into the now what, which gives more context to the situation. What have we tried? What have others tried? What constraints are there out there? And really, that now what is in the so what, if it's not a critical issue, the now what will look very differently than if the so what says that this is more of a crisis situation that needs to be dealt with right now. Okay. So we've been thinking about asking questions. We've talked a little bit about how to ask some good questions. The tricky part now is people have given you information, but are you using that information to think critically, or are you stumbling upon a great big roadblock when you're trying to work through the problem? Because first, did you not ask the questions? Do you not understand your thinking? But second, when you ask the questions and you're having a conversation with other people, were you really open to what they said? Okay? Or are you making, again, assumptions about what they're saying? Are you closed-minded because you believe it's my way versus their way, versus there being multiple ways to look at the situation? Sometimes even when people give us good information, we can't think critically about it just because we're fearful. We're fearful that we don't have the expertise that we thought we did. We're fearful that their perspective of the situation is going to create more work for us or cause the situation to be much more complex than we really want to deal with. The other thing is a lot of times, especially, and I see this a lot when I'm working with groups, people are just rushing to get to the solution. It's like, let me out of here, okay? So we really need to think about and get people to slow down their thinking and go back to, do we even know what the problem is before we even start giving solutions? And so many times we do that. And sometimes we don't always feel comfortable just asking questions. We all know those people who ask those really hard questions that we find difficult to be with sometimes because they ask hard driving questions, and sometimes it can be frustrating to be on the other end of that. But remember, if you're really working to solve, a problem, you really do have to ask some good questions to engage everyone in the process. Okay. Not last, but third point is we're going to break out very briefly kind of the steps to problem solving. And hopefully some of you will come to the course on problem solving and decision making, because as you can see, there are 6 steps and we're only going to talk about the first one. Lots of stuff to talk about. So problem solving means really defining the problem. A well-defined problem is a half-solved problem. We already talked about that. Then we need to analyze the root cause of the problem, come up with possible solutions, select the best solution, have an action plan, and then implement and evaluate. But back to the defining the problem. One of the easy ways to do that is what I would refer to as a gap analysis. A gap analysis is just looking at what's the current state versus the desired state and what's keeping us from meeting that desired state. Okay? If any of you have ever been unemployed, you can relate to this. The current state is I'm not working right now and I've got bills. The desired state is that I've got a job in my field of interest, making good pay, so that I can continue to pay my bills. You think about what's keeping me from reaching that desired state. Sometimes it's the economy. Okay, we don't have a lot of control over that. Sometimes it's our skills. Sometimes it's where we're living. There's multiple factors which we would consider in problem-solving process. But right now, we need to be clear to define a problem and come up with a good problem statement. We need to be clear about where we're at today and where we want to be tomorrow. We need to be clear about what those outcomes are that we want to achieve. And I've got some examples of those on this slide. So there's an example of how you take the current state and go to the next state. So as I said, I'm unemployed. Desired state is I want a job at a certain salary, that will support me in the way that I was used to living in, my former job before I became unemployed. Okay. If we are just focusing on writing the problem statement, I see this kind of as a 4-step process. The first step is to establish the need for the solution. That's the what. That's, to a certain extent, what the desired state is. And then it gets to justifying the need. That's the so what. We have to contextualize the problem. That's now what. And that also gets to how do you motivate and engage other people in the process. Okay? It's not enough just to say what the problem is. How do you get people to care? How do you get them to be engaged in? How do you give them a vision of where you're going so that they know what they're trying to accomplish and they have some energy around doing it? When you do these first things, then you actually have to practice writing the problem statement. Okay? So the first step is, establishing, okay, what the situation is. So when you think about that, what's the basic need? Again, we have to be careful about jumping to conclusions and giving solutions. We have to be clear about what the desired outcome is. And this is where you have to be open-minded and think critically. What's the desired outcome from multiple perspectives? There's what I want, but what's the right thing for the organization? What's the right thing for the customer? What's the right thing for our suppliers? What about the economy? What about the environment? There's multiple ways of looking at the outcome. And ideally, you should be able to look at it from a quantitative and qualitative manner. So what I mean by that is that you have some numbers that you can measure so that you can see if you're going in the right direction once you actually start problem solving, but qualitative just as to how people feel about the situation. Okay? And so there's some examples there. How do we increase customer satisfaction? Customer satisfaction ratings, we've got some numbers about how they changed in the last 5 years, okay? And why it's important. If our customers aren't happy, that obviously costs us money on the bottom line and then can potentially impact our staffing needs and our ability to provide promotions and compensations for our people. Step 2 then is justifying the need. Is the need aligned with our strategy and our needs? Okay? Who's going to benefit? What are the benefits? How will we measure the benefits? Okay? And then to a certain extent, we need to start thinking about how will we ensure that a solution is implemented. We have to start thinking about who's going to be accountable for implementing it. And that's why we have to ask that question, so what? Because who cares? Who's going to take the time and have the energy to actually implement it? And so again, I've got some example slides here for you to kind of think through and talk through those questions. Is it relevant to your strategy in your organization or even individually? Is it relevant to my personal goals? Okay. Who's going to benefit? Is it just me or are there other people who are going to benefit? As soon as you can name someone else who's going to benefit, you probably need to engage them in the critical thinking process and make sure you set up time to ask them questions. The third step is to conceptualize the problem. You know, the reality is, who wants to reinvent the wheel? Problem solving is not that easy to do. Having said that, you know, sometimes we don't want to start from scratch, and we don't need to if we can go back and learn from our experiences or other people's experiences. What have they tried? What have they done? What's worked for them? What hasn't worked for them? And so going back and trying to figure out what's worked, what hasn't worked, and then thinking about, do you know, are there any constraints currently in the system that could make this difficult or currently in your own life? Okay, you know, maybe it is that your plate is really full and you don't have time for another problem. So then how do you even prioritize which problem you're working on? Okay, and so it's thinking that in itself is a constraint, your time, your ability, your energy. And you have to be honest about that when you're thinking about, can I be part of this process or not? Then we finally get to the point where we're actually going to write the statement. Sometimes it's helpful to break the statement into smaller problems. When we think about, like that example that I gave you, that you're looking for a job, maybe you identify that you could work on building your resume. And so you might actually write a problem statement about how do I increase the quality of my resume? How do I improve the quality of my resume? How do I improve my interviewing skills? Or if it's a more complex organizational problem, how can you break it into smaller pieces that are easier for people to relate to and really work on? And it's also then identifying what are the nice to haves versus the have to haves. You really need to know what the differences are when you're thinking about that desired state. There's what we want to have, but sometimes we don't get what we want, we get what we need. And you have to be able to know the difference. So what is it we really need at a minimum to make this work? Who needs to be involved with it? But you also need to make the statement that so that it's not too technical and that people are motivated by the situation, because sometimes you're writing the problem statement or you're identifying the problem and you're bringing people in to work with you who have no perspective around the background. And so that's why you have to be clear about how to write a good problem statement. So there are again some specific examples of how to write a problem statement. The nice to haves versus the have to haves. And how do you involve others? And at this point, then, the last few slides are just some specific examples of problem statements as they are written out. And as if you'll notice, the example that I've got up right now actually is a little more general than the one on the next slide. But you can see that there is a general statement that customer satisfaction has decreased. It talks specifically about when it's decreased, how much it's decreased, and why we care about it. In the more detailed description, then it talks about, and this is the goal of a good problem statement, not to tell you where you're at, but a good problem statement will tell you where you want to be. so people know what it is they're trying to accomplish, okay, what the desired outcome is. So hopefully you can see a slight difference between the two. The other one talks about where you've been. This problem statement talks about where you want to go. It is helpful to have that perspective for many people who are trying to problem solve to see both of these statements, but it's much easier to work to finding a solution if you know where you want to go. This slide here is just another example that you can refer back to where you both have qualitative and quantitative measures. And what's nice about this example is it actually makes you understand why you want to do it. You know, do you get up in the morning really motivated to solve a problem? Sometimes if someone says, we have to reduce the cost by $2, is that really motivating? Can you give them a reason to be motivated? If you knew you could reduce the costs by something by $2 because it would help people have a better life, it would increase the profitability of the organization, those are motivating factors that help people better engage in the process. So it isn't just about identifying the process. It's also figuring out how to engage people to keep them motivated once they start the problem-solving process. So with that, the way we see the problem often is the problem. And so if we can better define what our problem is, oftentimes we will be much better off at solving the problem. So if you want to learn more, I look forward to seeing you on August 24th, 2016. It seems like a long way away, but we know how time flies. I'd love to see you to talk more about problem solving and decision making. At this time, I think we'd like to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Nan, for that intriguing presentation. Wonderful information. We did receive a couple of questions throughout. One that we would like to have you answer is, what is the difference between critical thinking and logical thinking? And can you please elaborate?
Well, I see them. You need to think critically in order to, you need to think logically in order to think critically, but they aren't necessarily one and the same. It's not enough just to think logically about a situation in order to be able to think critically, because logic doesn't always take into consideration how you and other people feel about the situation. It doesn't allow you to sometimes think about kind of allow for your gut and your intuition sometimes about a situation. If any of you have worked with an expert on any type of a problem, and maybe they've made the comment to you that, you know, I don't know why, but this just doesn't feel like a good decision, okay? That is actually being able to think critically. Logic basically says that there's sometimes a right or wrong answer, and the best answer that nobody buys into, a good logical answer that people don't buy into, isn't critical thinking. Critical thinking understands, do people buy into the answer so that the answer to the problem actually gets implemented. That's why you need to know how people feel also about the situation.
Thank you so much. Another question, and this one's a bit longer, so I'll break it up slowly. You mentioned that people come out of experiences with different perspectives on what happened. How important to you is the concept of debriefing? And do you have any advice on how to identify when this is necessary? And what are some effective ways to do this?
Well, let's see if I remember all of those. That's why I say sometimes ask one question at a time. The first one is, what was the first question? Debriefing. Oh, absolutely. I use debriefing. In fact, that you know, some people roll their eyes when they see me coming because it's like, oh no, Nan's going to make us debrief. You know, it's not uncommon for me just to ask at the end of almost any meeting I have with someone, what worked, what didn't work. Okay, because what I'm trying to do is understand the situation from their perspective. And so that's actually one of the most basic techniques I use almost any time I meet with someone, or even when I'm facilitating a group or even having a conversation with someone. What else do I need to know? What worked, what didn't work? What more can you tell me from your perspective? And so it goes back again to just asking some questions, one or two basic ones, to see what other information there is.
Awesome. You covered that all. Thank you. For practical applications, how does one recognize the crossroads at which the concept should be applied? Maybe a mental cue or a mnemonic?
I'm not sure if I know exactly what you're asking. For practical application, how does one recognize the crossroads for which the concept should be applied? I think for me is when you talk about what's a mental cue, for me a lot of times it's the nonverbal cue. Okay, are you looking across the room and recognizing that someone all of a sudden is looking at you blankly, or all of a sudden their forehead becomes wrinkled, their eyes furrowed, or maybe they start to disengage, they slide back. And if that is starting to happen, you're probably at a crossroads that they're seeing the situation from a very different perspective, and it's time to start asking questions and back up.
Wonderful. Thank you. You did mention a lot about how you have to be aware of the people that you're interacting with. And so with this, do you think that critical thinking is also considered empathetic thinking?
Absolutely. Absolutely, because it's trying to understand the situation from somebody else's perspective. It's hard to think critically all by yourself, personally, because we do have, tunnel vision around certain issues given our beliefs and our experiences. And to truly understand somebody else's perspective, we do have to listen empathetically. Otherwise, we're not hearing both what they think about the situation, we're not hearing what they feel about the situation. And sometimes how they feel about the situation is just as important as the data that they collected there, where those feelings came from. So it has to be both the data and how they feel about the situation.
Thank you. So kind of breaking it down for someone who may be nervous talking with people and approaching people to ask them questions, considering this process does take that into account, breaking it down and asking maybe more questions than people are generally comfortable with, as you mentioned, how would you suggest practicing these methods in their own time?
Well, practicing questions is a skill just like anything else, and you can start anywhere. I think I even find myself in any conversation just trying to think, how do I start this with a question versus with an answer? So even with my kids, we all do that. If you've got children, well, how was your day? And what's the kind of response we get? Good, not much of an answer. So, tell me what was good about today. And so just trying in any situation to ask a question when you're confronted with a situation, um, trying to ask the question differently, and you do get more comfortable in doing it. It's like any skill, it does just take practice. So practice on your family. You're not comfortable doing it at work. Or your best friends. That's what they're there for.
And then this would be the last question. How do we realize as individuals if we are critical thinkers or if we are practicing the methods that you taught us today?
Well, I think one of the easiest ways to do is just think about how much time you spend talking versus how much time you spend listening. Are you asking good questions to allow other people to be engaged in the process? And you want to know what? Sometimes we can just ask people. Many of us have trusted advisors in our life, people that we've worked with, and we can say, help me think about how I could think more critically. Okay. What do I do well when I'm trying to problem solve? What could I do differently? Feedback is a very powerful tool that actually is a good way to improve our own critical thinking.
Well, I want to thank you again, Nan, for doing this presentation with us today and sitting through us with the technical issues. And I want to thank all of you as well for kind of muddling through this with us. As I stated at the beginning of the webinar, we will be sending out an email with a link to the presentation soon. Another thing to look forward to are some upcoming courses that can further supplement what you learned today. The courses you see on the slide are just a few upcoming courses we offer. Visit our website for a full list of courses and educational programs. And we hope you enjoyed today's webinar as much as we did. Thank you and have a wonderful day.